Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Stokely, A Life by Peniel E. Joseph. This is from the preface. Stokely Carmichael is a troubling icon of America's civil rights years. His Black Power call became a national Rorschach test. Whereas many blacks viewed it as righteous, many whites saw violent foreboding. Newspapers brooded over Carmichael's words, quickly forming a consensus that judged the slogan to be at best intemperate and at worst a blatant call for anti-white violence and reverse racism. In 1966, Black Power reverberated around the world, galvanizing blacks, outraging whites, and inspiring a cross-section of ethnic and racial minorities. In 1969, Carmichael left the United States for Conakry, Guinea, where he reinvented himself as a roving Pan-Africanist organizer and professional revolutionary. For the next 30 years, he remained an energetic dissident, a throwback to the heady years of the 1960s. Carmichael turned the quest for black political power into his life's work. His faith in a style of politics many considered anachronistic came out of the same tenacity and stubbornness that once made him one of the most effective and controversial activists of his generation. These same qualities, however, limited Carmichael's efforts as a Pan-Africanist political mobilizer. Before leaving America, Stokely resigned as Black Power's glamorous enfant terrible. Telegenic, brash, equal parts angry and gregarious. Whether dressed in three-piece suits, leather jackets, sharecroppers' overhauls, or African dashikis, Carmichael became to represent the era's multifaceted identity, a hipster hero whose easy grace allowed him to consort effortlessly with both the dignified and the damned. The name Stokely Carmichael first came into my consciousness when I was a young boy coming of age in New York City. As the proud son of a Haitian mother who belonged to local 1199 Hospital Workers Union, part of SEIU, I grew up hearing stories of how civil rights activists, Black Power revolutionaries, Pan-Africanist freedom fighters, and trade unionists helped to shape a new world in America and beyond. By the time I was in elementary school, I was on my first picket line, accompanying my mother in support of an 1199 strike. Both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King supported 1199 during the 1960s. Stokely Carmichael's political importance came into sharper focus when I was in junior high after the premiere of the landmark PBS documentary series Eyes on the Prize, which featured the 24-year-old Carmichael's fiery Black Power speech and rightly characterized Stokely as his generation's heir to Malcolm X. Over the course of a decade of research on Carmichael, I would come to understand him as that and much more. Carmichael's youth, casual dress, and charisma made him an easily identifiable hero, one whose quick smile and passionate speeches left an indelible impression. An adopted son of the South by way of Trinidad, the Bronx, and Harlem, Stokely adapted to while transforming whatever environment he encountered. As a native New Yorker growing up in the city's tense racial climate of the 1980s, I found Carmichael's survival instincts appealing. As a young graduate student in Philadelphia, I had the opportunity to hear him speak and briefly met him afterward. He encouraged me to stay committed to the Black freedom movement, a struggle he defined as infinite. With his flowing African robes, gray hair, and white beard, he looked like a prince. And he had changed his name. He was no longer Stokely Carmichael. As Malcolm Little had become Malcolm X and later El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, Stokely had become Kwame Ture. It was a name that paid homage to his two African heroes, men who had been the first presidents of their countries, Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah and Guinea's Sekou Touré. Kwame Ture spelled the Guinean's name not as the French did, as white Europeans did, but as Arabs and Muslims did. Sekou Touré, S-E-K-U-T-U-R-E. As a college student, Carmichael helped transform America by organizing sit-ins, demonstrations, and voter registrations during the civil rights movement's heroic years, a period that roughly encompasses the decade between the 1954 Brown v. Board Supreme Court decision, desegregation decision, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and has become enshrined in public memory through national holidays, films, commemorations, and monuments. Carmichael's deep sense of justice contributed to his evolution into Kwame Ture, the Pan-Africanist revolutionary and anti-capitalist organizer who moved to West Africa and remained tenacious in the face of searing political setbacks. Carmichael ultimately judged America incapable of creating the free and just world he had struggled for as a young man. But despite living in Africa for the final 30 years of his life, Carmichael's legendary stature as a Black Power activist lingered even if many ignored his lasting contributions to civil rights struggles that included a bruising quest for the vote in the Deep South. Although today largely forgotten, Stokely Carmichael remains one of the protean figures of the 20th century, a revolutionary who passionately believed in self-defense and armed rebellion, even as he revered nonviolence. The book Stokely, A Life, by Peniel L. Joseph.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. It's a beautiful day to strengthen democracy. However, there are some folks on the other side of that. I'm going to get into that rant in just a moment about how the anti-democracy movement may be reaching a tipping point around the United States and around the world. What does that mean for us all? What is the best way for people to govern themselves, essentially? Also, in the first hour, if Democrats don't build back build back a better crime policy, they're going to be toast in this the election this November and in 2024. I'll tell you my thoughts on that. In our second hour, Julio Rivera is going to drop by. I want to know what Republicans are for. I think we've figured out what they're hysterically against, but what are they for? We'll get into that, and also how the CRT plan is working in Florida and for the GOP. I'll get into that. And in our third hour, I believe, maybe this is our, let me scroll down here. Third hour, yeah. In our third hour, Jaime Harrison, the chair of the DNC, is going to be with us about what the DNC is doing to protect our vote. Plans are beginning for also in the third hour, we're going to get into how plans are beginning for the endemic phase of COVID. California now is starting to lay the groundwork for structural stuff to say, okay, this is now like whooping cough. Well, I'll get into that in the third hour. Will it now be treated like measles? And our Geeky Science in the third hour. There are medicines you can take if you catch Omicron, and I'll lay some of that stuff out. But to start, and this, I referenced this yesterday kind of indirectly, but this is I think a more direct reference when we were talking about Ukraine and the possibility of war around the world and things like that. And I said, I really think that there's a larger issue at stake here. And this is the point. I wanted to organize my thoughts and write it down first, and I did. It's published over at HartmannReport.com today. The title is the anti-democracy movement. That's the anti-democracy movement reaching a tipping point in the U.S. and around the world. And I would point out that 2006 was the peak year for democracies in the modern history of the human race. And since then, we have seen democracies going away rather than building up. Now, personally, I lay a lot of the blame for that at the foot of neoliberalism, but that's a somewhat different rant. I think the Russian and Ukrainian conflict is actually probably that, and the China-Taiwan conflict are two of the areas that are really highlighting this difference in worldviews. And that's the thing that, while at the surface there's all this conversation about, is Russia going to invade Ukraine? Is Ukraine part of the historic Russian territory? Should George Herbert Walker Bush have kept his deal with Gorbachev and not expanded NATO? I mean, there's all these issues that are being discussed on a regular basis. But I think the bottom line is, should Ukraine remain a democracy, a self-governing democracy where the people, a majority of the people elect their representatives, or is it going to become more like an oligarchy, more like Russia is right now, a country run basically with an iron fist, as it were? I think this is actually a very open question, not specifically for Ukraine, but around the world, is this question of what's the best way for humans to govern themselves. Keep in mind, for about 5,000 years, the modern recorded history, the majority of human societies have not governed themselves democratically. In fact, democracies have been rare exceptions. Now, again, this is history, right? This is the history of empires, the Chinese dynasties, the Middle Eastern, the pharaohs in Egypt, things like this. On the other hand, though, when you look at Aboriginal and Indigenous people, you find a lot of societies that are very democratically organized. What you might call democracies. Certainly the Iroquois Confederacy, for example, this is one of the more well-known ones, but there are a number of them. In fact, they were the majority of American tribes, North American tribes at first contact, according to anthropologists like Peter Farb, who wrote Man's Rise to Civilization back in the 60s. But Freedom House, and so, this raises the question, what's the best way for humans to live? I mean, if human history, and even among Native American societies in North America, we had, the tribes here in the Pacific Northwest held slaves. You had down in the Southeast, down in the New Orleans area, you had, pyramid builders and sun gods among Native American tribes. You had some Native American tribes that were what you might call predatory. On the other hand, you had a broad swath of Native American tribes that were highly democratic. As I said, they were probably the majority in North America at the time of first contact. So what is the right way for people to live? Or is there one? When we look at nature, what we find is, up until maybe 30 years ago, the assumption was that all of nature is organized hierarchically, like the alpha dog and the submissive pack. But now we're learning, and I've talked about this on the program before. I wrote about it in several of my books. Now we're learning that democracy is actually pretty widespread in nature. You watch a flock of birds flying overhead, and all of a sudden they all turn to the right. Well, how did that happen? For most of my life, I was wondering if it was telepathy. Well, it turns out that every bird that is flying is voting. And if more than 50% of them move a quarter inch to the right, the whole flock starts, takes a 20-degree turn to the right. And the same with fish and schools of fish and things like that. So, democracy is clearly in our genes, but we keep ending up with anti-democratic or non-democratic forms of governance. And now we're seeing, as I noted, Freedom House, for example, reported this year, quote, "The share of democracies designated not free has reached its highest level since the deterioration of democracy began in 2006, when countries with declines in political rights and civil liberties outnumbered those with gains by the largest margin recorded over this 15-year period. They downgraded the scores of 73 countries that constitute 3/4 of the entire world's population, the United States being among them." Tom Malinowski, the Democratic congressman, just tweeted yesterday, "My office is now getting calls from folks who say they watch Tucker Carlson and are upset that we're not siding with Russia." So the entire Republican Party has largely rejected democracy. They're putting up legislation in state after state where if the majority of people vote for a Democrat, the Republicans in power can simply say, we're going to ignore the outcome of that election. And the people that we know are going to vote for Democrats, we're not going to let them vote. We're going to make it really, really hard. So I would say that the real question at the core of the Ukraine conflict, as well as the China-Taiwan conflict, same deal. You've got China, which is an autocracy, and although they are capitalist, as is Russia, capitalism and democracy don't have to go side by side. But you've got China that is an autocracy, and you've got Taiwan that is a democracy. And which will prevail? Each sees the other as essentially an existential threat. Or at least China in particular sees Taiwan as a threat. But the story on the surface is, this is just a breakaway, territory. So it seems to me that what's really at stake here is whether this consensus that began to form around the world after the American Civil War. Keep in mind, prior to the American Civil War, there were never more than 6 democracies in the world. After the American Civil War, we started getting more and more democracies. We hit a peak in 2006 with nearly 100. I don't have the exact number right in front of me, but it was in the low 90s. Again, depending on how you define democracies. If you call the highly functioning democracies, it was around 70. So we hit that peak in 2006, and we've been sliding downhill ever since. Why? Is this the power of autocrats? Is this the power of oligarchs who want to take down democracies? It appears that that's the case here in the United States, where you've got very, very well-funded campaigns to block small d democracy in the United States. It appears that, that may be the case in Russia, where you've got a lot of oligarchs who are not happy with the idea of democracy. And not just Hungary, it's happening. In Poland, it's starting to happen in a big way. We have anti-democratic movements that have emerged in Sweden and Germany and France and the United Kingdom. This is happening all over the world. It's kind of like a backlash against democracy. And, like I said, looking at the history of the human race and even the prehistory of the human race gives kind of a confusing result. And then, of course, you get, Donald Trump. I mean, look at the extraordinary damage that this guy did to democracy in the United States. He came along and for 4 years, openly admired autocrats and openly ridiculed Democrats, small d, people who were leaders of democratic countries. He blew off the EU and NATO and embraced, Russia and China and Bolsonaro and Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Mohammed bin Salman, the emperor of Saudi Arabia. It seemed like there wasn't a dictator anywhere in the world, or an autocrat or an oligarch, that Donald Trump didn't want to embrace, and a democracy anywhere in the world that he didn't want to make fun of. And this has now become orthodoxy in the Republican Party. I mean, you had a bunch of Republican senators who went to Russia for the 4th of July. So how does democracy stand? Does democracy survive? There are some very powerful forces. I mean, you've got Tucker Carlson now openly taking the side of Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict on Fox News. Fox News is owned by the Murdoch family, and Rupert Murdoch is the guy that former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd of Australia said was, quote, the cancer eating the heart of Australian democracy, end quote. And he talked about how, Murdoch damaged democracy in Australia, then went to the UK, damaged democracy there, then came to the United States and is damaging democracy here. Will it survive? Particularly, will it survive this attack from within the Republican Party and from within our right-wing media? There's a great story in today's, I believe it's the Washington Post, about how, it's on the Washington Post. It's titled, Bannon was deplatformed. Now an obscure media mogul keeps him on the air. How this right-wing billionaire has put Steve Bannon in front of 8 million people on Dish TV every day. I mean, it's just amazing. Where do we go from here?
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
I don't have a clear answer, but I do think that this is one of the issues that we should be discussing in America. Are we committed to democracy? And welcome back. Dennis in Aptos, California. Hey, Dennis, what's on your mind?
Well, there's plenty. First, I want to bring up this poll that was on, the major network media, cable news media this past weekend, that 72% of Americans don't like the direction the country is going in. And, even MSNBC, they kind of failed on this one. It kind of depends on who's on for the hour, of course. But there's no explanation behind it. And,
that kind of number, Dennis, is kind of meaningless without the granular data. I mean, I'd like to see America becoming more progressive. So, am I not happy?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Because if they were to ask me that question, but then I would ask them back, ask me why I think that,
right.
And I would say it's the Republican Party that's turning into the fascist party, that's passing voter suppression laws, that's obstructing anything Biden has tried to do, just like they did with Obama previously. Right. And I would talk about how, all these corporations have merged together, so there's a lack of competition, which isn't good for capitalism, by the way, and so on and so forth. Instead, it's kind of like, this is like the Republicans are going to win in November because so many people think America is going in the wrong direction. And it just, I want to tear what's left of my hair out.
Well, this is why I'm trying to take this to a larger discussion, which is democracy itself, our form of government itself. And our ability to even look at ourselves and our own history. Down in Florida, you got Ron DeSantis passing a law now that if you teach history that makes white people feel uncomfortable, you lose your job. I mean, it's like, okay, how do we have a functioning government if we can't even acknowledge our own history?
It's really crazy. And, that's the other thing about how these polls ask questions. Apparently, Republicans think our democracy is going away. Well, it is, in fact, but it's because of what they do, not because of anything Democrats are doing. It's because of what they're doing. And yet, I think this is their stance. We want democracy for white people and nobody else. Kind of like in South Africa, the old apartheid South Africa. It was a great place to live if you were a white person, perhaps even if you were colored, if you looked white enough. It wasn't for anybody else.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I do, and I don't think that this is. I don't think you can boil it down quite that simply. Although, because frankly, I don't think most Republicans actually want democracy. I mean, even for white people.
Exactly.
I think what they want is a powerful daddy figure who's going to make everything safe and everything's going to be good, and don't worry, daddy's in charge. That's what I think most Republicans want. And that's not democracy. Democracy is messy,
they think
loud.
That's democracy. They think that's democracy because it's going to protect only them.
Yeah. Well, we'll see. We'll see how this works out. Dennis, thanks for the call. I appreciate it. We'll be back. Stick around. It's the Thom Hartmann Program. We're going to pick up. I want to talk about crime too. This, I guarantee you, this is going to be a huge issue in this election coming up. Nobody's talking about it right now. You're going to hear it first. Here, stick around. Missed my opening rant today? It's usually published over at HartmannReport.com, where you can read it and share it with your friends for free. Check it out, HartmannReport.com. So there's this group in Stockholm, Sweden. It's called the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. They are, world famous. Every year they periodically they release a report called The Global State of Democracy. And they just released their 2021 version of this. And in this, they point out that the world is becoming more authoritarian, I'm quoting from their report, as non-democratic regimes become even more brazen in their repression, and many democratic governments suffer from backsliding by adopting their tactics of restricting free speech and weakening the rule of law. Now, who is backsliding? They go on to say the United States is backsliding. The bastion of global democracy, the United States, fell victim to authoritarian tendencies itself and was knocked down a significant number of steps on the democratic scale. We are a backsliding nation. There's a whole video about this over at thomhartmann.com. Check it out. So we've got this, the other point that I wanted to put on the table for us to discuss here in this hour is crime. Specifically, and this is kind of the micro view, but there's a macro story behind it, a larger story behind it, but specifically carjacking. Carjacking, there was a story here in Portland that went kind of viral in the local newspaper about how people would be acting like they're in distress on a road. Like somebody would be stopped at a stop sign and somebody would run up and go, help me, help me. And you'd roll down the window and they'd reach in and open your door, or they'd pull your door open and grab you and take your car and drive off. And the lesson was, don't stop when somebody says, help me. But it's now reached the point, and not just in Portland, but all over the country, where we've got these carjackings that are even being done at gunpoint. And I mean, the number of carjackings has quadrupled in New York City in the last 4 years, nearly quadrupled in Philadelphia. It's up everywhere in the country. And it seems to be mostly being driven by teenagers. Now, there are some folks, this CNN article about it by Peter Nikias and by a couple of writers at CNN anyway, is arguing that this is because pandemic soft on crime policies, and I put those in quotes, are causing, in other words, the desire during the pandemic not to keep people locked up in jails, which are like incubators and, spreaders for disease, have caused offenders to get out while they're waiting for their court dates and reoffend. Maybe. There are other folks who are suggesting, no, this is like inflation. This is just transient. This is, kids are not in school and people are not at work because of COVID, and when COVID goes away, this will stop. I don't know. I mean, one of my kids has had 3 different vehicles stolen. None of them, thank God, were carjacked. They were all just stolen, but still, it's like this, shall we say, crime wave in America is becoming extremely problematic. Bill Clinton responded to this by putting 100,000 cops on the street. But, there was also all that talk about super predators and a lot of laws that ended up disproportionately harming mostly black people and also Hispanics, people of color. Stop and frisk, this was Giuliani's big solution. No, it didn't seem to make any difference, but hey, it sounded good for PR. So, I have some more thoughts on that. I will share with you on the other side of this break. Stick around. I want to actually do a bit deeper dive into this whole issue of crime. Stick around. We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes past the hour, and then I'll pick up your phone calls. What do we do about democracy? What do we do about crime?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back. Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy. This is from the introduction, titled The Big Picture of Social Control versus Democracy. This book deals with 2 very large and often amorphous concepts, privacy and surveillance in the context of government and the marketplace. Both concepts have undergone changes over the millennia of recorded human history, and those changes have dramatically sped up and expanded over the past few centuries, starting with the widespread use of the printing press in the mid to late 15th century, when books and newspapers began to proliferate across Europe, and in the rest of the civilized world by the end of the 17th century, civilized in quotes. The development of radio, television, and the internet in the 20th century heightened the need to define more clearly what both concepts meant and how they applied both to governments, the public sector, and to individual and corporate players, the private sector. The thought police and Big Brother are terms introduced into the popular lexicon by George Orwell in his novel 1984. Big Brother was the overweening, all-powerful government of Orwell's novel, and the thought police were those who managed to burrow so deeply into every citizen's behavior, speech, and even thoughts that they could control or punish behavior based on the slightest deviations from orthodoxy. Orwell was only slightly off the mark. Big Brother types of government and thought police types of social control are now widespread in the world and incompatible with democracy, as I'll show in more detail later in the book. Most concerning for Americans and citizens of other democratic nations, in quote, the mentality of both has heavily infiltrated both American government and corporate sectors, reaching so deeply into the day-to-day details of our lives that the techniques and technologies they use can and do not only control, but predict our behavior. The goals of those who violate privacy and use surveillance is almost always social control and behavior modification. Setting aside pure voyeurism, these are the areas where money is made, power is accumulated, and political or business goals are reached. And whether they are of government or of corporate Big Brother, the goals are largely the same and consistent with those just mentioned. Secrets are now for government and giant corporations to know and hold, but not for average people. And they're used by Big Brother to both acquire and hold power. J. Edgar Hoover had secrets to hide, for example, so he knew well their power. A gay man at the pinnacle of American power for most of his life, the FBI director knew that in many U.S. states, he and his lover, Clyde Tolson, could be prosecuted and sent to prison for their private, consensual behavior. Yet Hoover and Tolson lived together, and their relationship was an open secret among Washington's cognoscenti. I still remember a beautiful summer day in Ireland, Louise and I sitting in the living room of author Anthony Summers and his wife Robin, as they described to us the shocking details of Hoover's life and abuses of power they'd uncovered writing Official and Confidential, The Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover. That books like Summers weren't published until after Hoover's death is a striking testimonial to the power of surveillance and the blackmail material it can produce to keep powerful people's secrets hidden even from the world's best investigative journalists. Every politician or reporter of any consequence knew that Hoover had a file on him. They were almost all men back then, and powerful men at that time were far more likely to harbor salacious secrets, ensuring Hoover an unbroken hold over the FBI from its founding in 1935 to his 1977 death. But Hoover didn't use his massive FBI surveillance powers just to cow politicians and reporters. He was also interested in advancing policies close to his heart. A dedicated white supremacist running an FBI where all meaningful power was held in white hands throughout his life, Hoover, or an underling at his behest, famously sent FBI surveillance tapes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. having an extramarital affair to the civil rights leader himself, implying that they'd next go to his wife and the public if he didn't commit suicide. Hoover also spent his entire career downplaying the role of Italian organized crime in the United States because, among other things, mafia godfather Santo Trafficante had the goods on his sexual orientation and regularly hosted him and Tolson for gambling junkets. When, in 1961, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy overruled Hoover and began prosecuting the mob, with the number of cases brought shooting up from dozens annually to over 700 a year in the early 1960s, the mafia backlash eventually destroyed the Kennedy dynasty. There's a more modern story of how surveillance and invasions of privacy have impacted American politics. The rise to the presidency of serial rapist, wannabe fascist, and crooked businessman Donald Trump. The biggest big brother of the corporate world, Facebook, had for years been compiling massive troves of personal data on Americans, even Americans without a Facebook account, as any page with a Facebook logo on it can send your browsing activity back to Facebook. And sometime in the mid-2010s, Cambridge Analytica hired a data scientist to put together an app that could suck down that data without Facebook's knowledge. Cambridge once bragged that they ended up with more than 4,000 data points on each of 230 million Americans. The book, The Hidden History of Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy, by Thom Hartmann. Our 1-hour free podcast recaps our show, and it's available wherever fine podcasts are found. And we have the full 3-hour podcast available over at thomhartmann.com if you want to really support our program. 34 minutes past the hour. Okay, so I just laid out how carjackings are up like 400% in Chicago and Philadelphia and in many other cities. Crime is up. Somebody tried to break into our house a couple of months ago. I mean, this is, and did, a couple of houses down from us actually broke in, and our neighbor was in the shower, came out of the shower to discover somebody riffling through their house. People are freaked out about it. Now, there is a really important reason why this is so, it's obviously important, but so politically potent. Abraham Maslow, back in the day, the famous psychologist, came up with a hierarchy of human needs. It's often characterized as a pyramid. Maslow hated the pyramid idea, but that's usually how we see it. And at the foundation of it are the basic needs. The need to breathe and eat and regulate your body temperature. Just homeostatic needs. The next step up from that are safety needs. Above the safety needs, you find the social needs. Above the social needs, you find the intellectual needs. Above the intellectual needs, you find things like love and companionship. At a more individual level, then at the very top, he had self-actualization or spiritual insight or something like that. But the bottom line is that safety is at the bottom of this pyramid, or near the bottom of this pyramid. So, in other words, if you're walking across the street and suddenly the light changes and you got cars whizzing all around you, you are not thinking about who you're going to vote for in the next election. You're not thinking about what you're going to watch on TV that night. You're not thinking about your relationship with your best friend or with your partner. You're not thinking about, the state of the economy. You're thinking about, I got to get safe now. It drives out all other thought. Because on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, wherever you are stuck, everything above that point vanishes. This is how important safety is, and why it's such a potent political weapon that I guarantee you Republicans are going to be using against Democrats in the coming election. They're going to be saying, Democrat-run cities are not safe. Look at all this crime. And there will be some truth to the fact that crime is up. Now, we can talk about, the pandemic was a disruptive event. The economy has become more unbalanced. The schools were out for a year. There's a whole bunch of things that we can point to say, well, that's actually what's going on. But this is going to get visceral. And frankly, I think if the Democrats don't get ahead of this by coming up with specific strategies to deal with this, and by the way, they're not mysteries. Community policing, for example. Getting cops out of cars and onto the streets, walking around, same cops, same neighborhood on a regular basis, cops who by and large look like the neighborhood. Community policing. It was arguably the one thing that Bill Clinton did for crime that not only was politically advantageous, putting 100,000 cops on the street, but had a positive impact. Now, putting the wrong cops on the streets or putting poorly trained cops on the streets will backfire badly. Which brings you to number two, which is, let's upgrade the profession of policing to a profession. And some of that is going to involve taking on the police unions. Now, I'm a big fan of unions, but most of these police unions are not really like unions. They're protection rackets for bad cops in many cases. So, for example, better training, community policing, getting more police out there, revisiting how we punish. It's not quite the right word because, again, I am haunted by this movie. Michael Moore's movie, Who to Invade Next, or Where to Invade Next. That was it. Where to Invade Next. Where, he goes around the world and he looks at all these different, kind of government systems and says, maybe we could borrow this, maybe we could borrow this. And he goes to Norway and looks at their prison system. And it's like, oh my God, they're actually focusing on rehabilitation. Their assumption is that all these people are going to end up back in society, or the vast majority of them. And so we're not going to damage them further. We're going to keep them from society, and we're going to train them, teach them, rehabilitate them, give them skills, and then bring them back into society. It's a very different thing from the United States, where our prison system is based on, in large part, the old plantation system where somebody gets out of line and you throw them in the hole. So I think that there's a lot that can be done and a lot that must be done, but Democrats need to get ahead of this whole issue. So I'll leave it there and pick up your phone calls. Dave in Federal Way, Washington. Hey, Dave, what's on your mind today?
Hey, not too much, Tom. Look, I basically want to say you are 100% right, but I just want to emphasize a couple of things, if you'll allow me to. Look, Joni Ernst was on over the weekend talking about how Joe Biden is so weak because he wants just to give money, cash money to the Taliban when we need to protect women and girls in Afghanistan. All right? Look, women
and girls are starving in Afghanistan right now. There's
right.
10 million people on the verge of famine.
And I just want to defend something I say occasionally. I occasionally say, look, there's no difference between the GOP and the Taliban. Even the most liberal person says, what, are you crazy? There's no evangelicals, killing women and girls. Look, it all comes down to money, Tom, and it all comes down to power. The best example I can think of, all right, the shortest, quickest thing for people to look at to see what I'm talking about is read the book Dune by Frank Herbert, and there's a new movie out about it. Republicans are House Harkonnen. Power only exists for power's sake.
Yeah, no, I get it. And Dave, I absolutely agree with you on that point, and I think that's probably the most important point to make. Thank you. Ron in Berrien Springs, Michigan, it says you disagree with me. About what?
Yeah, if we disagree with the policy of going to war with Russia or preparing for war with Russia over Ukraine, a corrupt country, not unlike Vietnam, we become what? Pro Tucker Carlson? Give me a break.
Ron, I don't think you've been listening to my program. I am not saying that we should be going to war with Russia over Ukraine. What I was saying is that there's a much larger issue here, and that is the fate and future of democracy in the world. Now, whether you go to war to defend that or not, whether you do diplomacy to defend that or not, whatever. But, I'm not going to let you mischaracterize what I'm saying like that. Maurice in Berlin, Germany. Hey, Maurice, what's on your mind?
Hi, Tom. A beautiful day to you.
Thank you. Back at you.
I want to talk about the saying history not learned is history repeated. Mm-hmm. And in my 78 years, I've been through a lot of history, and there's been moments of reprieve, and it just goes from one disaster to another, moving right along. And there were people that came along in the meantime, like Franklin Roosevelt and the Brave New Deal. And at that time, Smedley Butler, a general in the Marine Corps, was approached by the high-ranking Republicans to overthrow President Roosevelt by leading a band of veterans. And it's just history that goes back and repeats, and people never learn, that all this is going on, and we're just standing by good men who do nothing. That's my for today.
Okay. Thank you, Maurice. And this is, I think you've identified a very real problem. Diane in Hazel Crest, Illinois. Hey, Diane, what's up?
Hi, Tom. I'd like to comment on the topic of crime that you wanted to discuss.
Please.
I live just outside of the Chicago area. Now, crime is quite prevalent, mostly in the inner city, and it's mostly caused by a lot of the gang activity that's in Chicago. But the carjackings have increased astronomically recently, and a lot of that has to do, I think, with the ability to have access to certain parts of Chicago. Mostly on the north side, it's increased incredibly, and that's mostly dominated by whites. Now, my problem with this is that black-on-black crime has been evident in Chicago for a long time. Personally, I don't have a solution for that. I think a lot of it has to do with gangbanging. But as far as the carjackings, I don't blame white people for not wanting to support black people when you have to worry about somebody hitting you in the head or carjacking your car. We are validating everything that these people have against us by behaving this way. And I really do think that they are justified, and I'm justified because I'm scared, too, of my own people.
Yeah.
And everyone is using poverty as an excuse for this, Tom. am 65 years old. I remember a time when you could be poor as a church mouse. You didn't want to hit somebody in the head or carjack their car.
Diane, I lived in, Louise and I lived in Detroit, Ann Arbor, Lansing, but, I've lived in Detroit several times in my life. And there was a time when people in Detroit mostly had jobs, and Detroit was a very prosperous place, back 60s, 70s, the early 80s, before massive car imports started competing with Detroit. And then, we got neoliberalism, the destruction of the unions, the pay going down, factories closing, moving overseas, and Detroit became economically kind of a wasteland. And then crime exploded. What I see over and over, and you can see this in country after country, and it doesn't tie necessarily to race, is that in those countries where you've got a strong and thriving economy, you typically do not have a large crime problem. People are busy. They're earning a living. They're providing for their families. In those countries that are going through shock therapy, that are going through this whole neoliberal thing of destroying unions and shipping jobs overseas and cutting wages and cutting benefits, you do have a crime problem. It seems like a fairly clear correlation to me.
Well, and I agree with that, but I also think it has a lot to do with how society has changed and how people raise their children now. And I remember, like I said, when I was young, we had more pride in how we raised our children and the things that we placed value upon. And I'm sorry, it just seems like the integrity and our morality has changed within our race, that it makes it so easy for us to go down that path. I
think you're identifying outliers and thinking that they're the majority, Diane. Or at least I hope that's the case. I
hope so too.
Yeah. Diane, I got to run, but thank you for the call and thank you for your thoughts. Diane just perfectly made my point. If Democrats don't get ahead of this issue now, it's going to hit them in the face in November. Yeah, I mean, obviously there's quality of life issues here, and let's all be reasonable and let's have a nice country to live in. But there's also the political aspect of this. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Which raises another question. Is the so-called crime wave that's going on right now the result of Donald Trump coming along as president for 4 years and saying, law doesn't matter? And welcome back. Let's see here. Cindy in Marina, California. Do I have it right, Cindy?
Marina.
Hey, Cindy, what's up?
It's like some of the QAnon people think that Donald Trump was bestowed with magical powers, almost like a god. Do you remember when he said he could shoot someone on a main street and get away with it?
Yeah, on Fifth Avenue, yep.
Like a deity.
Yeah.
Now, even his signature on when he signs his name is like a little crown. So since we've already, in our Constitution, divorced ourselves from the descent into dystopia by wanting to secure the general welfare and promote the well-being of our nation, it's just hard that people want to throw a kind of dystopic tune to everything that's manufactured through algorithms and stuff to keep us depressed. It's not a dystopia. We live in a country that wrote The Wizard of Oz. It's not a dystopia.
So, in other words, let's reclaim America for Americans. I'm not quite sure exactly what
America has always been great.
Yeah. Okay.
It never needed to be made. It could always improvement, but it was already great.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all sides of people, all kinds of people, from rural people to urban people.
Yeah.
People are basically good.
Well, and that's the ultimate debate, and that's the point. And Cindy, thank you for pointing that out, because that's the point that I make in my article today over at Hartmann Report. Is that there was this debate between Hobbes and Rousseau. I mean, they were 100 years apart, but it was this debate is the core nature of humans good or evil? And out of that, you decide what kind of government you're going to have. James in San Diego. Hey, James.
I've got
self-organizing systems. And the way I see this working is self-organizing systems tend to be bad for humans. Like communism, where they set out to not have a hierarchy, and let everyone kind of do what they do best, tend to get taken over by the bullies in the system and then collapse. A current example, I think, would be like 4chan, which was very broad, free form, and then kind of took over by the neo-Nazis.
Right. Yeah. So, and or America. we tried to be democratic, and then we get Donald Trump, and the current Republican Party. The bullies are taking over. Now the question is, will the bullies hold, or will the people take it back from the bullies? And the bullies are trying to change the rules of the game so that the people will not be able to take it back from them.
Right. I think the antidote for this is the way we've seen protests being organized better and better. Books like from Lisa Fithian, Shut It Down, where she talks about creating consensus over broad groups of people, with everyone having an equal voice, but coming together with a common consensus.
Right. Yeah. I get it, James. And consensus society is a great and noble idea. James, thank you very much. We'll be right back. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Hey, remember Andrew Wheeler? He was this coal lobbyist that Donald Trump plucked out of obscurity and put in charge of our nation's environmental protection agency. He was the EPA administrator. He's the guy who said there was this new pesticide they wanted to bring to market. It causes permanent brain damage in children. He said that's fine. Put it in the food supply. He's the guy who raised the levels of mercury and radiation to which children can be exposed. He's the guy who closed down the EPA's Office on Children's Health. He's the guy who shut down the EPA's office that provides scientific advice to Congress. He's the guy who stopped enforcing the Clean Water Rule so that the polluters could have a field day. He's the guy who told the oil and gas companies, hey, we're no problem on methane. We're no longer going to enforce the legal limits. And of course, he's the guy who ditched the rule that required cleaning up toxic coal ash. He is now the Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of Virginia. And he's got that job because Virginia just elected a Republican governor. There's a video about it over at ThomHartmann.com. Check it out. Welcome back. Let me just toss one other thing into this crime thing. In fact, maybe this would be a good thing to do a random, for tomorrow or later on the week. Is the question: is what we're seeing with crime in the United States simply an example of follow the leader? Societies tend to, whether we like the great man theory of history or not, and all this kind of stuff, hierarchy, whatnot. Societies tend to become like the people who lead them. And for 4 years, we had a leader who was a criminal. He was openly a criminal. Everybody knew he was a criminal. He committed multiple crimes right in front of us. And so for 4 years, our young people were being taught by the President of the United States that if you can get away with it, it doesn't matter what it is. You want to rape women? If you can get away with it, hey, Donald Trump got away with it. You want to You want to sexually assault them? Hey, Donald Trump got away with it. Therefore, it must be good. You want to steal from people, even your own relatives? Donald Trump stole millions from his own brothers and sister, apparently. He got away with it. It's good. You want to steal from your own government? No problem. Is the crime problem that we're facing the result of Donald Trump setting the example? And if so, should that be part of the Democratic Party's messaging? Anyhow, I just tossed that out. I think it's a fascinating notion, as it were. Rios in Marietta, California. Hey, Rios, what's up?
Hey, Tom, how you doing?
Good.
I just wanted to make a comment about the situation about crime and neighborhoods of color. The first thing that people need is a job, money to provide for themselves and then their family.
My point.
Without jobs, you're going to need money. Where do you get money? You knock people upside the head. You see that going up, like you said, Tom, that crime goes up when there's no jobs. I remember in the 70s, my father worked for GM in Delaware. He was laid off every summer for from the 1970s, early 70s. Then suddenly, no job. Everything went to China. My neighborhood went from a blue-collar neighborhood to a crime-ridden, crack-ridden neighborhood within 6 months.
Exactly.
This is the problem.
Yeah. just throw police at that, and you can't just throw cash at it and say, you know, or free housing or anything else. People, because jobs are also associated with a sense of identity, with a sense of dignity, and also for most people, their workplace is their primary community.
Tom, you always hit the nail on the head, man, and that's why I listen to you all the time.
Thank you.
The issues that you bring up about crime, no matter what anyone says or anyone calls in about, it's not about people wanting to hurt other people. People need money to feed themselves, to feed their family, to have some kind of positive mindset to go forward. Without money, the positive mindset is gone. It's a negative mindset that's super hard to get rid of unless you have the funding to go forward and become a positive thinker. Thinking about education, thinking about how do we get your kid to football practice, how do you get your kid to parochial school without any of the funding that you earn, not given, that you earn. The positive mindset will always be on a negative end. You cannot give people a positive mindset. They have to earn.
Yeah, and it's not just the cash reels. It's also that sense of community and belonging that people get from having a job where they work with other people that they like and they feel like their work is meaningful.
Black Wall Street. That's all I got to say.
Okay, Rios, thanks a lot.
They did their own thing, and what happened? Everything was perfect.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about Omaha, yeah, I know what you're talking about. Rios, thank you for the call. That was Nebraska. Yeah. Anyway, we'll be right back. Stick around.
support the Thom Hartmann Program. They are HelloFresh, the #1 meal kit delivery service. More info at hellofresh.com, code TOM. CB Distillery, CBD for sleep and pain relief. More info is available at cbdistillery.com, code TOM. Wild Alaskan Company, 100% sustainable wild-caught seafood delivered right to your door. More info at wildalaskanocompany.com/Tom. Cozy Earth, better sleep, better you. More info at CozyEarth.com, promo code TOM. Dynavite, a whole food supplement for your pet's immune system. More info at dynavite.com. And ExpressVPN, the VPN that just works. More information at expressvpn.com/Tom.
Today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Big Brother in America, how the death of privacy and the rise of surveillance threaten us and our democracy. This is from the introduction, titled The Big Picture of Social Control versus Democracy. This book deals with two very large and often amorphous concepts: privacy and surveillance in the context of government and the marketplace. Both concepts have undergone changes over the millennia of recorded human history, and those changes have dramatically sped up and expanded over the past few centuries, starting with the widespread use of the printing press in the mid to late 15th century, when books and newspapers began to proliferate across Europe, and in the rest of the civilized world by the end of the 17th century. Civilized in quotes. The development of radio, television, and the internet in the 20th century heightened the need to define more clearly what both concepts meant and how they applied both to governments, the public sector, and to individual and corporate players, the private sector. The thought police and Big Brother are terms introduced into the popular lexicon by George Orwell in his novel 1984. Big Brother was the overweening, all-powerful government of Orwell's novel, and the thought police, for those who managed to burrow so deeply into every citizen's behavior, speech, and even thoughts, that they can control or punish behavior based on the slightest deviations from orthodoxy. Orwell was only slightly off the mark. Big Brother types of government and thought police types of social control are now widespread in the world and incompatible with democracy, as I'll show in more detail later in the book. Most concerning for Americans and citizens of other democratic nations, in quote, the mentality of both is heavily infiltrated both American government and corporate sectors, reaching so deeply into the day-to-day details of our lives that the techniques and technologies they use can and do not only control but predict our behavior. The goals of those who violate privacy and use surveillance is almost always social control and behavior modification. setting aside pure voyeurism, these are the areas where money is made, power is accumulated, and political or business goals are reached. And whether they are of government or of corporate big brother, the goals are largely the same and consistent with those just mentioned. Secrets are now for government and giant corporations to know and hold, but not for average people. And they're used by Big Brother to both acquire and hold power. J. Edgar Hoover had secrets to hide, for example, so he knew well their power. A gay man at the pinnacle of American power for most of his life, the FBI director knew that in many U.S. states, he and his lover, Clyde Tolson, could be prosecuted and sent to prison for their private, consensual behavior. Yet Hoover and Tolson lived together, and their relationship was an open secret among Washington's cognoscenti. I still remember a beautiful summer day in Ireland. Louise and I sitting in the living room of author Anthony Summers and his wife Robin, as they described to us the shocking details of Hoover's life and abuses of power they'd uncovered, writing Official and Confidential, The Secrets of J. Edgar, Secret Life of J. Edgar Hoover. That the books like Summers weren't published until after Hoover's death is a striking testimonial to the power of surveillance and the blackmail material it can produce to keep powerful people's secrets hidden even from the world's best investigative journalists. Every politician or reporter of any consequence knew that Hoover had a file on him. They were almost all men back then, and powerful men at that time were far more likely to harbor salacious secrets. Ensuring Hoover an unbroken hold over the FBI from its founding in 1935 to his 1977 death. But Hoover didn't use his massive FBI surveillance powers just to cow politicians and reporters. He was also interested in advancing policies close to his heart. A dedicated white supremacist running an FBI where all meaningful power was held in white hands throughout his life, Hoover, or an underling at his behest, famously said sent FBI surveillance tapes of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. having an extramarital affair to the civil rights leader himself, implying that they'd next go to his wife and the public if he didn't commit suicide. Hoover also spent his entire career downplaying the role of Italian organized crime in the United States because, among other things, mafia godfather Santo Trafficante had the goods on his sexual orientation and regularly hosted him in Tulsa for gambling junkets. When, in 1961, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy overruled Hoover and began prosecuting the mob, with the number of cases brought shooting up from dozens annually to over 700 a year in the early 1960s. The mafia backlash eventually destroyed the Kennedy dynasty. There's a more modern story of how surveillance and invasions of privacy have impacted American politics. The rise to the presidency of serial rapist, wannabe fascist, and crooked businessman Donald Trump. The biggest big brother of the corporate world, Facebook, had for years been compiling massive troves of personal data on Americans, even Americans without a Facebook account, as any page with a Facebook logo on it can send your browsing activity back to Facebook. And sometime in the mid-2010s, Cambridge Analytica hired a data scientist to put together an app that could suck down that data without Facebook's knowledge. Cambridge once bragged that they ended up with more than 4,000 data points on each of 230 million Americans. The book, The Hidden History of Brother in America, How the Death of Privacy and the Rise of Surveillance Threaten Us and Our Democracy,